Most wars produce obvious winners and losers. Cities are damaged. Economies are strained. Alliances shift under pressure. But sometimes the biggest beneficiary of a conflict is a country that is not firing a single shot. As instability spreads across the Middle East, one of the most strategically important regions in the global energy system, an unexpected question emerges. Could the country quietly gaining the most from the turmoil be China? Not through military intervention, not through political dominance, but through energy security, trade relationships, and the architecture of global finance. Because modern geopolitical competition is rarely decided only on the battlefield. It is often decided inside the systems that move oil, money, and industrial power across the world. And few countries are positioned inside those systems, quite like China. To understand why, we first need to look at the structure of China's economy. China is the world's largest energy importer. Its industrial system, from steel and chemicals to manufacturing and transportation, depends heavily on foreign oil. According to data from the International Energy Agency, China imports roughly 70% of the crude oil it consumes. Much of that oil comes from the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and United Arab Emirates are among Beijing's largest suppliers. At first glance, that dependency might seem like a vulnerability. If conflict spreads across the region, supply disruptions could threaten China's economic stability. But global energy markets rarely behave in simple ways. Oil does not belong to one country once it enters the international market. It becomes part of a globally traded system where supply, demand, and risk expectations determine price and flow. And that system creates opportunities for countries that know how to navigate it. China has spent the past 2 decades building exactly that kind of flexibility. State-owned companies such as China National Petroleum Corporation and Sinopec have invested heavily in long-term supply contracts across the Middle East. These agreements often guarantee steady oil shipments even during periods of geopolitical tension. In some cases, they are paired with infrastructure investments, refinery partnerships, and joint energy projects. The result is not simply oil imports. It is a network of economic relationships that connect Chinese industrial demand directly to Middle Eastern energy production. And that network can become more valuable when the region grows unstable, because geopolitical risk changes how energy flows across the global market. When conflict escalates, many Western companies become cautious about long-term investments or infrastructure projects in volatile regions. Insurance costs rise, political risk increases, financial institutions tighten lending for projects tied to unstable areas. But China's state-driven investment model often operates under different constraints. State banks such as the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China have historically funded overseas infrastructure projects, even when Western capital becomes more risk-averse. That means periods of geopolitical uncertainty can sometimes create openings for Chinese financing. Oil fields, ports, pipelines, and refineries still need investment. And when fewer global investors are willing to take that risk, the partners that remain often gain stronger influence. This dynamic has appeared repeatedly in recent decades. In countries facing sanctions or diplomatic isolation, Chinese companies have sometimes become some of the only major investors still operating. One example is Iran. International sanctions, particularly those imposed by the United States Department of the Treasury and its global financial enforcement networks, have limited Iran's access to Western banking systems. That has significantly constrained the country's ability to sell oil through traditional financial channels. Yet Iranian oil has never fully disappeared from global markets. Instead, much of it has continued flowing east. and China has been one of the primary destinations. These shipments often move through complex trading arrangements involving intermediaries, shipping transfers, and alternative payment systems. But the broader result is clear. China continues to receive discounted crude oil from a country that faces limited access to many other buyers. Lower energy costs can translate into meaningful advantages for a manufacturing economy the size of China's. Energy is one of the foundational inputs for industrial production. When oil prices rise globally due to geopolitical tension, most importing countries face higher inflation and increased production costs. But if a country maintains access to discounted supply, that pressure can be partially offset. That advantage becomes even more significant when viewed through the lens of global competition. China's manufacturing sector competes directly with producers in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. Energy costs influence everything from factory electricity prices to transportation and shipping. So when competitors face rising energy costs, even small pricing advantages can ripple across global trade flows. But oil markets are only one part of the story. Because Middle Eastern instability also reshapes diplomatic relationships. For decades, the United States has played a central security role across much of the region. Military partnerships with countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain have formed the backbone of that security architecture. Those alliances remain deeply significant, yet regional governments increasingly balance relationships with multiple global powers. China has expanded its diplomatic presence in the Middle East steadily over the past 20 years. Energy trade is often the foundation, but it is increasingly connected to broader initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative. Ports, logistics hubs, industrial zones, and digital infrastructure projects are being built across multiple countries in the region. Each project strengthens economic ties between Chinese companies and Middle Eastern governments. And that connectivity can translate into long-term strategic influence. At the same time, China generally avoids direct military involvement in regional conflicts. This approach allows Beijing to maintain economic partnerships with countries that may have tense relationships with each other. For example, China imports oil from both Saudi Arabia and Iran, despite the long-standing geopolitical rivalry between them. That balancing strategy reflects a broader principle in Chinese foreign policy. Economic connectivity often takes priority over political alignment. If you're interested in how power, oil, and money shape the world behind the headlines, consider subscribing to Rise and Ruin: Power of Wealth. Because the deeper story here is not simply about oil shipments, it is about how global systems respond to instability. When conflicts erupt, governments focus on military strategy. Markets focus on risk. Investors search for safe assets. Energy prices fluctuate, and supply chains adjust to new realities. Inside that turbulence, countries positioned at the intersection of trade, energy demand, and financial flexibility can sometimes gain quiet advantages. China sits precisely at that intersection. It is the largest trading partner for many Middle Eastern economies. It is the world's largest energy importer, and it possesses enormous domestic industrial capacity that converts raw energy into manufactured exports. When global energy markets become unstable, those characteristics can amplify each other. Consider shipping routes. A large share of global oil exports travels through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important maritime choke points in the world. Any escalation that threatens traffic through that corridor sends immediate shockwaves through energy markets. Oil prices can rise rapidly in response to perceived supply risks. Higher oil prices generate additional revenue for exporting countries, but they also reshape diplomatic leverage. Energy importing nations become more dependent on stable suppliers, and long-term customers, particularly those purchasing large volumes, gain strategic importance. China is one of those customers. Its scale makes it indispensable to many oil-exporting economies. That economic reality encourages producers to maintain stable energy relationships with Beijing, even during periods of geopolitical tension. There is also a financial dimension. Much of the global oil trade is still denominated in US dollars. This system, often referred to as the petrodollar structure, links energy markets closely to the international financial system centered around the US Federal Reserve and global dollar liquidity. But China has gradually explored alternatives. Energy trades settled in yuan have increased modestly in recent years, particularly through platforms such as the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. These volumes remain far smaller than dollar-denominated transactions, yet the direction of experimentation is notable. Periods of geopolitical tension can encourage countries to diversify financial arrangements, especially when sanctions risk or financial restrictions become more visible. If energy exporters begin accepting a wider range of currencies for trade, the long-term structure of global commodity markets could gradually evolve. And China is one of the few economies large enough to support such a shift. Still, none of this means China controls the outcome of conflicts in the Middle East. Wars remain unpredictable. Energy markets react to countless variables, and instability carries risks for every major economy, including China. But influence in the modern world often emerges from structural positioning rather than direct confrontation. Energy demand, industrial capacity, trade networks, financial systems. Countries that sit at the center of those systems can sometimes benefit indirectly from disruptions occurring far away. And China has spent decades positioning itself inside the arteries of the global economy. If this helped you see the bigger picture, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Rise and Ruin, Power of Wealth for more documentaries on oil, power, and the forces shaping global finance. Because the story of modern geopolitics is no longer just about territory or military victories. It is about who controls the systems that power the global economy. And when those systems are shaken by conflict, the biggest winners are not always the countries fighting the war.